everybody. Thank you for being here. No, you're good. I was waiting for the break. I saw it happening.
A lot of
Thank you for
kid
being
stuff
here.
happening.
Yes, there is lots of stuff happening.
Sorry.
All good. Thank you for being here. It's supposed to be a great afternoon. I hope you can all get outside after, because this is, wow.
It's great.
Somehow our spring break has 80-degree weather. Everybody else's spring break has 80-degree weather. We're here. So afternoon should be lovely. So over our spring break, actually, we had a lot of respondents to our needs assessment survey. So that's my priority today, to talk a little bit about. So remember last time we talked about what that needs assessment survey would look like and how to push it out to the community. We had about 820 responses, wow, which is pretty good.
Than we've ever
That's
had.
pretty good.
That's a lot.
So
Yeah,
I think that's great. And then I'm thankful Chris put out a Spanish version of the survey as well. And we had a handful of responses come in on the Spanish survey. So hopefully we were able to reach, a different portion of the population who's normally been able to reply. So that was great. We got some feedback there, especially as it relates to Title III funds, which, if you remember, is related to our English language learners and our immigrant population. So, so anyway, so that's what some of you apparently were doing over break, which I appreciate. We had mostly our responses were from parents, though we did have a decent number of staff members also reply. Few community members and board members, just to kind of give you an idea of where the responses came from. They were all over the place. Keep in mind, this was a checkbox option. So if you have multiple children in the district, you checked off boxes of multiple schools. Okay. So it wasn't necessarily that only parents of only South students were responding to those, but parents of South students may have also been clicking on the other boxes. And those are our responses, which again, we're pretty good and pretty well spread out throughout the district. All right, so the questions, remember what we did is I took out a lot of that language that was in the form and tried to make it as transparent as possible and as simple as possible, which hopefully yielded some of those good response numbers. I have the main categories that I put in the survey, which are the allowable uses, right? We talked about allowable uses way back in November, and what those allowable uses are. So I put those in as the options, and again, these are checkboxes, so people did select multiple of the allowable uses, and then there were also comments made. I breezed through the comments a little bit, and I still have to put them together in a little bit better of a way. I will say that a lot of the comments that people made about what other areas they perceived would be good uses of our title funds are not under those umbrellas of allowable uses. So as much as we've talked about it, some of the comments were free lunch. We've talked about this.
Yeah.
We would all love to be able to do that. Unfortunately, it's just not something that we're able to do. So there were some great ideas that we're a little handcuffed in how we're able to spend those funds. But there were some other ideas that I think that our district we'll be talking about what those comments were, just as some parent feedback about what are the what are the priorities as far as parents are concerned, and what are the perceptions that are out there. But again, what we see is that biggest need or that biggest priority area that was identified was a reduction of student-to-teacher ratio in Title I schools. So pretty obvious one there. And then also some need for mental health professionals and counseling. And keep in mind, this is especially in our Title I schools. So those Title I schools do vary year by year. We have a few who will remain a Title I school, and then others that change a little bit. The other thing to keep in mind, remember we talked about Title I school-wide program versus targeted assistance. So this would look a little bit different for how we can and how we do spend money in, say, Ocean Ave, because that's our school-wide program, versus the targeted assistance models. So we're able to use money a little bit differently in that school-wide program, and I've heard great things from them. They've been very appreciative of having things like the ability to bring in outside presenters that they weren't able to host for assemblies. They were able to send kids out to field trips that otherwise they had not been able to do in the past. So they've been, they actually had a field trip scheduled for that day that we were supposed to get hit by snow, and there was a big hubbub about whether it was going to happen, and good news, it did. There was no snow, or at least not enough to keep them in school. So we were able to fund some of those things, which I think was great. So here's some, again, you know, the allowable uses that you see, and then where those priority areas were. Right now, where we see most of our Title I monies spent is somewhere between that pull-out support, instructional support, right? We can kind of classify that reduction of student-teacher ratio in how we spend some of the monies for our interventionists. I'm trying to think of the other big buckets that we use. We already offer extended day intervention with those before and after school learning academies. I think we talked about last time how that used to be a title grant funded program, and basically the data that we have to keep is it's a lot of minutia. So we've been able to fund it locally. So we're able to fund those programs locally. They are already off the ground and running. So we've been already inviting kids and working with kids in that after school and before school model.
And just to give you a little bit of a perspective, because this is relevant to the driving down student-teacher ratio. So going back to what Devin said about the school-wide targeted assistance, in a school-wide building like Ocean Avenue, school-wide program, you can fund a staff member's salary in totality. In buildings that are targeted, you can't, because they are working with students that are Title I versus non-Title I. So targeted means there are certain students who may receive benefit from funding. So when we fund a portion of our interventionist salary for a targeted school, it's proportional to the amount of time they're working with Title I students. There's a report we have to fill out monthly. It's a time activity sheet which demonstrates that we're maintaining those thresholds. Another piece of perspective I want to give you is, so when we defray the cost of a salary for a teaching staff member, a full-time equivalency it's called, we also have to fund a portion of benefits. So like that money gets eaten up really quickly. So for example, you know, a lot of our salaries that we fund, you know, we try to fund the lowest salaries possible because obviously that makes sense to squeeze the most funding out of our pool. We only get about $500,000 in Title I, give or take, year to year, because it's dependent upon that census we talked about. But when you start to think about benefits and salary, if you fund a full salary and benefits, you're looking at close to, and now you're basing this on a brand new first year teacher, you're looking at about $80,000, because 50 plus about 30,000 for the benefits package, for a piece of it. Or which we don't have a lot of our interventionists who are inexperienced teachers, that's not typically who we would put into that role. You're really looking at probably somebody who's making $70,000, $80,000 a year plus the benefits. So when you look at only having $500,000, that money gets eaten up really, really quickly. So we spread that wealth amongst our interventionists for those targeted schools. So that's why when you see the board agenda every year that comes out and shows the funding, it's only funding a portion of it. And it is inclusive of salary and benefits. So, you know, it does go so quick. Mm-hmm. It's not as much as, you know, it seems to be.
Anything that you're seeing or thinking as it relates to Title I before we start to talk about Title II?
Can I just clarify on
sure.
For Title I? So like for Leonardo, we have the what were you just saying? The interventionist.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
So and that's because we're Title I, right?
No,
or no?
Every school has an interventionist. Okay. So we years back when we first started putting interventionists in the schools and also funding pieces of this through Title I, we created thresholds within the district based on like school size. Mm-hmm. So like if you had X number of students, you were entitled to, you know, either a half-time or a full-time interventionist, which is why we still have some shared interventionists in the district, because they're smaller schools and they're non-Title I.
That's what I was going to say. So for Leonardo, we have full-time in our school.
You should only have a half-time based on your size.
Right.
Okay. But you have.
But
Well, we
because
go
we're Title
full-time.
One, then they're full-time?
If
Or
what?
no, because we're Title One, then we're full-time or not?
We decided to do that, not because
Okay.
we were required to. We said Title I schools typically,
Mhm.
because of lots of demographic variables,
Right.
usually have a higher need of students that need intervention.
Right.
So we made a dedication within the district to say, hey, look, we are going to make sure that our Title I schools have a full-time math and a full-time literacy person. Like, if you look at River Plaza, for example, versus Leonardo, similar size, right?
Right.
Like, between 200 and 300 kids, give or take. River Plaza has a half-time of each. They share with another building.
Mhm.
They're a non-Title I school. Leonardo has 2 full bodies, one doing math, one doing literacy. So when we did this years ago, we decided that Title I schools needed to have that full-time people because they would have more need, just based on their demographics. We also attempt, because you're finite in the amount of money you have, to fund those interventionist salaries more. I mean, it doesn't give us more in intervention people, because whatever we don't cover with Title I gets offset by the district budget. It's really more so like manpower. Listen, in a perfect world, where we had, infinite amount of money and, didn't have to worry about staying within confines and balancing a budget, I would love to see a third interventionist put into Title I schools, kind of as like a generalist that can do both content areas. Maybe in the future we'll get to that place, but our Title I schools do have full-time people purposefully.
Which is great. Like, so that's why when you said, I think at the last meeting, that we were on the cusp of
Yes.
not being, when I had gone to the PTA meeting, I said, get those like free and
Absolutely,
reduced
yes.
lunch numbers
Yeah,
up to
yes.
keep our full-timers.
Reforms.
Yeah, and
So
that
that's-
matters, right?
Yes.
Right.
Now, we wouldn't be in a situation like that. We have a couple of schools, Leonardo being one of them, Harmony is another one. They bounce along, like kind of back and forth within the poverty threshold every year. And
Mhm.
what ends up happening is if you miss the threshold one year, we can maintain you for like kind of like a safe harbor year. And I haven't seen it happen too many times where like we bounce somebody out, because usually the next year they're back in again.
Right.
Because in a small school, it takes 1 or 2 free and reduced lunch kids to kind of tip it back the other way.
Right.
So we wouldn't be super quick to be like, oh, nope, this year you're not
Yeah,
in,
you're
get
out,
them out of
yeah.
there. But if there were a few successive years where we saw that it was gonna be a maintained status,
Mhm.
we would then maybe start to evaluate that. But it's good that we're like promoting getting those forms in, because that is how we base it on. Like when
Right.
we go into the grant application every year, we have to put the number of kids that are enrolled versus the number of kids that are free and reduced lunch. And it bases our poverty level on district statistics, right? Our funding, the amount of money we receive per student is from the census, but our poverty line, what is considered our Title I cut, is based on our statistics year to year.
Mhm.
So like, if you have a year where lots of people turn in their forms and,
Right.
then you might have a year where you bounce back in. Obviously, there's some schools that are clearly out all the time, and then certain schools that are like convincingly in all the time, but there are those that kind of are on that blurry kind of middle line. Fairview's one of them. When I first started with the grant, they were not a Title I school, and over time they've become, but they're like just barely in. Leonardo, Harmony, like I said, New Monmouth used to bounce until Port Monmouth combined, because that created like a bigger need. Thorne's always convincingly in. Bay Shore's kind of on the fence every once in a while, but not really ever too much in jeopardy, because they pull from a grouping of other Title I schools. So when those kids get here, obviously we're combining those numbers.
I understand that we're also in a position where we now have a lot of data to support where our interventionists are most needed and where they need to go. So when we first set it up, we had identified that like there's a correlation between Title I schools and needing interventionists, right? So now we have all that data to support how many kids we're supporting in each of these buildings to know where we really need to support those students. So it's not just about Title I status, it's also very much about where there is
About
that
need,
need.
yeah.
But Title I is what
Yeah,
allows us to
kind
fund
of.
some of those salaries, so it's
Right.
absolutely helpful
How
in that way.
do you have, how many kids does it take in a smaller school to,
Depends, because usually the threshold for Title I versus not is somewhere around 11 or 12% range.
okay.
So that gives you a little perspective.
Yeah.
In order to be a school-wide, technically you're supposed to be at 40% of your population free and reduced lunch. Ocean Avenue is not, they're about 32, but you can still apply to be considered as a school-wide because you've been able to, you have a high level, which 32 is still high. And you've also been able to demonstrate that through targeted money, you've made gains, which we could do with Ocean Ave. So when we applied for the status of school-wide, probably 3 years ago at this point, it was granted even though we did not meet that 40 threshold. And they have the highest, they're usually about 31, 32-ish. And then, you know, a couple schools that are in the 20s, a lot of schools are in the teens, like those other Title I schools, and then there are those hoverers that bounce between like 11, 12, and it really depends on where that cut line falls as to whether or not they maintain that status. But again, like Leonardo, if they didn't meet it purely, well, we funded them anyway, because we can for a year. So we'll see what happens next year with, you know, those numbers.
Is that your SBSS person too?
No.
Those are
they're
just all-
separate, yeah, we don't fund any of their salaries. It's just math and literacy interventionists. Although we could fund with that money, but, you know, it doesn't benefit us to spread it so thin. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it really, it's, so the law changed, or the way the ESSA accountability requirements changed a few years back, and I think we might have talked about this early on, is that there's language that's referred to as supplement, supplant. You cannot supplant district operating funds. Now, that used to be based on programs and positions. So for instance, if I were funding a program, say I was buying foundations, and this is how actually we started in the district with foundations, and why some schools had it first and others did not. The supplement supplant language used to be based programmatically or position-wise, which meant in a Title I school, if I use Title I money to pay for your program, I can't put it into another school because I'm supplanting. Like, if I want it to be for everyone, I need to put it in my district budget. They changed that language for it to only be monetary amounts now. So I just have to be able to show over and above what the district operating budget is that I'm spending more in Title I schools. Now, there's a game behind the scenes, you can play with that, right? Like, you have to use these funds to work for you versus against you. So every year when we craft our district budget, we know approximately how much federal money we will receive, and we can build our budget so on paper it demonstrates that we're over and above, right? Because that's all we have to show now. When it was programmatic and position-wise, it was challenging because that would mean if we had interventionists that were funded with title money, we would not be able to put them in the non-title schools. But obviously that's an unfair situation, which is why the language changed. And that was probably 7 or 8 years ago that they made that switch. So, yes.
I think I know the answer, but when you get the free and reduced lunch forms, does the district have visibility into the numbers before the state does? Like, can you be like, ooh, we didn't get a lot from this school, and we usually do, we need to go out and reapproach the parents about filling
They
it out?
come, I believe they get submitted to the business office first.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you guys see it, it's not like you're waiting for the state
Yeah.
to tell you what
Yeah.
schools, you actually
So
know.
it comes into the business office first,
Okay.
and then we input those numbers into the ESSA application.
Okay,
So like we ask the business office, send us the numbers for the statistics of free and reduced lunch students, and then from there, we input that information.
and what's like the range of time, the window to accept the application? Are you
Like
able to-
0 time.
Okay, so you're
It's-
not
it's
really able to
tracking.
manage it,
It's
so
tracking.
we're not tracking on this, let's go.
Yeah, so here's the typical turnaround time. We have to have our consultations and structuring out our meetings with our own staff, because we have to entertain other stakeholders. We also manage non-public, so we have to consult with them. And we base it on a projection of like 80 to 85% of what we received the year before, because they don't have numbers.
Okay.
Usually those numbers come to us, I've seen it as early as the middle of May, I've seen it as late as June 30th, with the application due July 1st, not kidding. And then they extend it, and, you know, it's like, it's basically the same circus every year.
Okay.
It's gotten better, but it really is like a very, very, very tight turnaround. You know, the bad news is you can amend your grant application once it's approved. However, amendments take a really long time to get approved at the state level. There's multiple layers of, you know, kind of checkoffs. And also, the more amendments you do, the more you're opening yourself up to audit.
Yeah.
Because they're like, oh, red flag, these people don't know what they're doing. So we try to be very prudent with like getting it right the first time. But again, like it is not a quick turnaround time.
And the time of year that the parents are asked to fill this out, is it beginning of the school year, end of the school year?
So here's another thing. It's also a lagging statistic.
Okay.
right? So when we ask for these numbers, it's at the end of the year when we collect, so it's always a year behind.
Okay,
So what's being submitted this year matters for next year.
okay, so it's, okay,
Yep.
got it.
Yeah, because unfortunately, it's like point in time data, once we put it in, that's what your statistics become for that grade year.
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to think of what are the opportunities to try to increase response rates?
Yeah.
So that if you're missing people,
Yeah.
is it a time of year thing where the parents are overwhelmed, there's just so many forms coming home?
No,
like,
you know what,
looking at
unfortunately,
Back to school mode where you're just filling out stuff every
I-
5 minutes?
There's a piece of me, like, obviously, we try to do a good job in promoting this at the building level, but there's also, I hate to say this, but there's like a stigma attached at times to submitting free and reduced lunch forms, and it's a really tricky conversation for building administrators to have with parents, like, if they haven't submitted,
Yeah.
because it's kind of like a touchy subject, like, you know, some people may not want to submit because of their personal
Yeah.
beliefs or their feelings, so it's hard. I mean, we want to get people the support they need. So if we see, you know, like principals most oftentimes, if they see a parent that had submitted but then maybe hadn't submitted the next year, they can follow up. Or if we see a kid who's forgetting lunch often, or, you know, just other things like that. But it's hard to promote it without making it uncomfortable.
And there's no
for
way,
people.
it's a state form, so I know you can't edit it, there's no way to be like, this is a form that everybody fills out, and then you kind of say, okay, here are the ones based on the data.
Yeah,
is now
no,
in parts that-
it's based on like
It's a
need.
hand
So like,
raising,
yeah,
right?
like you need to like say, I need the need, I have a need,
Okay,
I need to submit this.
okay.
You know, we encourage people when we have opportunity to do so, but it's, again, it's tricky to kind of put that out in mass and say like, hey, tell us if you need assistance, because some people will not,
Yeah.
because they're private or whatever reasons, and I can respect that,
Yeah.
so.
Or they know their kids won't eat the lunch, so they're not gonna do it. But I'm like, that's what we were just
Okay,
saying. I'm
right,
like, if they're not
that's
gonna eat lunch, but you still, it
Right.
dictates
It's
so
just
many other
driving-
things.
It's driving so many
Lunch.
important things that
Well,
it's,
and it may be why you saw such an increase in our promotion of it at the beginning of the year, because there was free lunch before, right? So,
Right,
you know,
right.
these are real important. We
Right.
made these forms. It's
Right,
not just
right.
about free lunch, but also this year, if, you know, if you need that assistance, please, my
Right,
goodness,
it's
fill in
free
those
lunch.
forms.
Listen, I was loving the free lunch
Oh,
lunch.
it's amazing.
For, I rode those coattails for quite, so I was like, really, I gotta pack a lunch this year? I was like, you're buying again.
Is there any way, I know this is like crazy, but give feedback to the state, like rename the form. It shouldn't be the free
it
reduced lunch
shouldn't be
form.
called
It
that,
should be
yeah.
the Title I eligibility of funds for the school and PS also lunch form or something.
Yeah.
Right.
Because it seems like then people might know that there's
Yes.
so much more to it. But if the state, obviously you guys
Yes,
can't
your
change
kids don't
the
have to
state's
eat the
form,
lunch.
maybe
Yeah,
let them know.
yes,
like-
it's not really
Yeah.
about lunch.
It's, I mean, we have often have like meetings where we talk about federal grants at the county level, we can
Yeah.
certainly give that feedback.
All right, so Title II, keep in mind now our money's diminished very quickly. So Title I was about $500,000. Title II was 135,000 for this year. So again, we predict about 80 to 85% of each of these funds for the following year. We'll find out hopefully soon, but this is why we're looking at the priorities now before we have monies is, okay, where do we want to put them? And then we'll be able to identify how much we're receiving in funding. Again, maybe May, we'll cross our fingers for May, but probably June. So Title II, these were the buckets. It's primarily, it started as more of a professional development grant, and then in the last, I'm not even sure how many years, but the last number of years, they added that we can use funding to reduce class size and then reduce that student-teacher ratio. So that is how we have been using the funding in the last number of years anyway, and it is also identified very clearly as a top priority to hire teaching staff to reduce that class size. Again, you can do some quick math there. If we got about $135,000 in this fund, we're talking, you know, about one teaching staff position, and then we drive a lot of our professional development out of that.
And this doesn't have to be split funded in any way, it's like the whole salary only, but it does have to go to the K to 3 level. So you can only reduce, it's for primary grade class size reduction.
So this is where we talked about, remember, it's the K to 3, and it's where we're seeing high numbers in that class, like grade range, in a particular building, you know, that we can say, hey, you know, it would be beneficial to reduce this, whatever, second grade class at this elementary school or third grade class, whatever it happens to be, and that's how we can reduce that a little bit. But we can't continue to fund the same salary with it, so it's a, you know, again,
Moving
we
target.
have to look at every year of where would this position best be used, and it can't be the same one year after year.
Just can't be the same person. So we just bounce that salary around. With the lowest paid person, because then we get
Yeah.
the most out of the money. There's a game. I hate to say it, there is.
It is.
There's
there
a
is,
strategic way
always.
to do this, so you get the most out of your funds,
Yeah.
but, we've become good at that shell game and being able to cover ourselves too for compliance reasons.
And then after that, again, was a lot of professional learning and different topics. So what I saw was that social emotional learning and STEM were at the top of those ranges, but there was still a lot of interest in different types of professional learning. And again, I saw some of the comments were very specific in where people would like to see that professional learning go. There was a lot of mention in the arts, in specific program implementation. What else did I see? And then, again, mental health. So not just that social emotional learning when it comes to professional learning, but really teaching, helping our teachers better understand mental health and as it impacts our students in the classroom and what that means for how they learn and how we can better help students learn in the classroom. So that's kind of where our Title II priorities were identified, where we can spend the money. And again, using this, I'm going to predict that we're, again, going to try to play the shell game, find another salary to reduce, keep a classroom teacher, to keep those classes as small as we can somewhere, and then fund some of our PD to go with it. I think we were able to use some of this for the Cerevallo training this year.
Yeah,
For a
so
lot of that time.
it varies. Usually when we write the grant, we keep that line item pretty generic to encumber like a lot of different potential things. Again, it's another trick to be able to pair this with your district PD budget to serve the needs of the district. Like if I compartmentalize this and say it's only gonna be for this and it's only gonna be for this, then I become a little handcuffed in like having this money be mobile. I like this as being a loosely structured pot of money that we can supplement things that are happening in the district with as it's happening versus being like so locked in. Because again, we go back to that, if I do that then and it changes, I have to do an amendment. And like, I get cranky when we have to do an amendment, like, the state gets cranky, like, it's a hassle. It takes forever. Like, I've had amendments sit for months. And I'm like, hello, is anybody gonna approve this? Because technically, you really shouldn't spend the money until the amendment's approved, because it has to be, like, brought through accounting. So like, if we ever got audited, they would wanna see that we didn't spend that money. It has to be tied to the specific account you're spending it from. So, every once in a while, the business office will be okay with bending it a bit because they know that this is just a really long, drawn-out process, but we try not to use that too much because we don't want to draw red flags to any kind of, accounting things.
So we keep it very generic in terms of description.
Yeah.
We're able to use it to fund some of these bigger projects that we have going in the district. So when you hear about some of those bigger projects, that is one of the ways that we're able to fund them, and then also a lot of little ones. Title III is English language acquisition, language enhancement, and academic achievement. So again, this is really supporting our students who are English language learners in various ways. Again, money goes by real fast. This one was less than $21,000 for this year, so we'll predict about the same, maybe a little less for next year. And this one, I will say, so this title may affect the fewest if you think about it. Families and students and programs. So this one I got a lot of comments on, not applicable, I couldn't even tell you where I would put this money. I think I tried to make it not a mandated question, but I still got a lot of I don't knows for this one. And most of the comments in this section were irrelevant as to where the money can be spent, because again, for most, it's not applicable. So they were throwing other different ideas at me as to how to spend the money that I can't do. It'd be great, but it's just.
I don't need that, so can
But
I have
I
this?
don't need that, so can you
I don't
maybe do
need
something
that,
else for me?
so,
Like,
yeah.
I understand, but no. And also, again, not putting the buckets of money on the form, people don't realize just how little this is. But this is what we have, and we've talked about the ways that we've used this for this year and in the past, in terms of training, in terms of supplies, somewhat in terms of translation services. That's the other answer that I was going with. It's amazing too when I look at the list of languages that our families speak. We're fortunate to have a few teachers in the department and in the area who are at least bilingual, if not multilingual, and many of them it's a Spanish and English, but many of our families, it's not Spanish that we need to communicate with them with. So it's been, very interesting to try to find different apps and different translation services and different resources for students to make sure that we're, trying to meet them where they are in their language and help them now, acquire English as their second language. So, yeah, again, fascinating when we look at the statistics. Maybe next time I'll get you a list of those, but it's very interesting. So that's what we've been doing with Title III, which, like I said, is so specific, but that's kind of where the monies go, is to a lot of resources, somewhat training, and then those translation apps. And then Title IV, this PAC goes up a little bit. It was almost $50,000 for us this year. Title IV is, remember we talked about for well-rounded education and extraordinary education is the other way that we look at it. So sometimes we're able to fund things like our gifted programs out of this. We've been able to fund parts of our academies and pathways that kind of drill down to that career education and anything that helps prepare our kids for those career pathways and high school pathways that we're running. It also goes towards mental health services and partnerships there. So these priorities were a little bit all over the place in terms of there wasn't a clear winner here, right? But there was definitely a perceived need or perceived priorities in school-based mental health services and partnerships, which we have already allocated a lot of monies to in the last few years out of these funds, and then also those programs and activities across multiple disciplines. So again, that's where we really target how can we fund some cool stuff for our students in the gifted programs, but also in the Arts Academy and in those pathways. It's how we can fund some of our middle school elective classes, those activity arts cycle classes. They're doing things like robotics, so we're able to fund things that they can use in those classes out of Title IV, things like that.
And the tricky part with Title IV is that within the funding, there's a proportional balance that has to be kept on how you spend. So there's 3 buckets: technology, well-rounded education, and mental health. So we have to make sure we sit within certain thresholds. For instance, just one little piece of it is that you can't use more than 1% of your money to fund actual technology equipment.
1%?
Yeah.
$500.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
So
So,
we bought a hotspot.
Right.
You bought an iPad?
Right,
Ish.
not even, half an iPad.
A piece of an iPad?
Right, piece of an iPad, and then so most of our money is spent for well-rounded, which is what you're looking at with accelerated learning programs, the pathways, gifted and talented, STEM, all that kind of stuff, and then the other piece is the mental health component. And then it says you have to spend anywhere between, 2 to 100% on each of them, but it has to be all proportionally balanced. You have to be able to demonstrate that you're staying within those ranges. So if this is a pain in the neck to figure out, because now, and not because it's a pain to figure out what you want to do,
Yeah.
it's more so inputting it into the grant, so
Yeah.
you tag the right places, so when they run this consistency check, it doesn't spit it out and say you're out of proportion, blah, blah, warning. But there are buckets and parameters for actual spending within this pile of money, which make it a little trickier.
I will mention there was drug and violence prevention activities and then child abuse awareness and prevention programs. We actually have really good partnerships in the town and in the county. All of those are provided to us for free, basically, with our county partners and our local partners. So between the Middletown police coming in and working with our students in grade 5, and then throughout middle school, they're actually coming back in to work with our high school students again I should know the name of the program, and I can't think of it off the top of my head. What is it?
Lead.
No, that's 5th grade. High school, they're doing a new one. They've been doing these for so many years. The high school is slightly different. So that one is really an emphasis on opioids and prevention there. So very powerful, but that's what they're doing there. And then child abuse awareness and prevention, right? I'm sure we've all heard about the CAP program coming into the elementary, so they do that there in the younger grades. We have some, again, county partners that come in and work with our staff. So I think that we're fortunate in that we don't have to spend our monies on those areas, and yet they're still being addressed by professionals in those fields. All right, and then Perkins is our new one, maybe. So Perkins is a new one because it relates directly to CTE, right, that career and technical ed bucket of money. So again, for those maybe not in the know so much, this year is our first year really implementing a true CTE program at the high schools. We have our business pathway that's being run as a CTE program, so we had it approved by the county and I think by the state. I assume the state had to approve it last year also. But we got all of that in place. We have our curriculum addendums that were done. We have those specific courses that our students are attending in that business pathway. So now that we have a pathway that's up and running in the CTE area, and it is confusing, I will say, that we use the word pathway for Middletown programs, but when I say the business pathway CTE, that's a state word that they're using, so this is a very specific pathway. But anyway, since we have our business program at the high schools, now we are eligible to apply for funding through Perkins. So because we have the pathway, now we're able to apply for funding. That could go toward improving that CTE pathway. It could go towards implementing a new CTE pathway. It could go towards writing curriculum for it or another CTE pathway. And it can also go down the line, so we can start using that funding in things like our middle school programs, where we do some of that business ed prep. So some of our cycle courses have that business focus. So we could also use the funding in those sorts of ways to prepare students to be more successful through that business pathway. A lot of the feedback that I got on the form and in other avenues through this was a lot of looking for more hands-on programs, CTE and otherwise. So I will say that as a district, we have been talking about that a lot as well. Business CTE was a great way for us to get our feet wet, so to speak, and to be able to implement a program that already was in existence, so we could kind of get into it gently and softly. But we are looking into other opportunities to get kids, we'll use the hands-on word more, right? So we're looking at programs that we could implement for students who aren't necessarily college bound, for other trades and other activities. There was other comments in here about promoting things like partnerships with the Monmouth County Voc programs in schools. So in those areas, so they get their own monies. That's how they run their programs. But anyway, there I will say that there was a strong push for how do we get our kids to do more in this area, but in a hands-on sense, in a career prep sense. So those are areas that we're looking in, and then again, we've not received this funding yet, so not knowing how much we're even eligible for, how can we look into, for us to do some of those hands-on work, we're looking for very specific teacher certifications and very specific facilities. So what would it take for us to get there is kind of our next moves of, what's reasonable, what will it take to get there, and then how much state and federal funding can we rely on to be able to do those things.
So we've been having this conversation at the county too, because as Devin had said, the CTE, more vocational driven pathways, they're expensive, right? Because you're looking at like lots of equipment. So I think of things like culinary arts or automotive or, like engineering classrooms, like lots of space needed and lots of equipment needed. Everybody's kind of in the same boat unless you had like an existing auto shop that back from like the 80s and 90s, like when I was in high school, that we had an auto shop, right? We had a printing room, like, you had like the shop room, like there was stuff but that got phased out. So if you retain those, maybe you're in a good position to have some space to do some of those things. Most places are not, right? Like we would be looking at retrofitting. So what we've started to talk about in the county is, yeah, we have the vocational schools, but their enrollments are limited and they're actually dwindling because they are having staffing difficulties as well. So where, they're very selective on who gets to go into those programs, especially things like cosmetology, automotive shop, culinary, et cetera, like the very popular ones. We've started to say there are some high school districts in the area that have some established CTE pathways. For instance, we partner with Keansburg currently for the law enforcement pathway, because we don't have that up and running. So we have this send a relationship with them where we can send kids to Keansburg if they wish to participate in that pathway. I think there is great and realistic opportunity to create partnerships within the county where we won't have to run a full complement of CTEs. If we can all get our ducks in a row in the county and everybody can take on something different, then we can share in sending to those programs. There's a lot of things to work out behind the scenes, but this little bit of Perkins money and our ideas about what we think it should look like are great, but realistically, monetarily, and certification, there's a lot of pieces, so we think more of like this shared kind of system that sits outside of the proper vocational, where there's lots of partnerships between high school districts. So, like we have a business pathway, maybe somebody wants to come to our business pathway, maybe we have kids that want to go to somebody else's automotive program or to somebody's cosmetology program. The one thing I also wanted to mention is, it is confusing because we picked business first, which, I don't know that, in hindsight's 2020, probably should have been our first choice. We have a business pathway that exists at our high schools, and it is a little confusing, and now they're competing courses, which is not good either. So what we've decided to do is embed the CTE within the pathway. So if you are a business pathway student and you decide, hey, I'm gonna be in the business pathway, you're gonna get the CTE endorsement as well. So like if your child is saying, look, like I wanna go into business someday, I'm interested in this, we have a course sequence that we suggest that kids take in the pathway. The CTE courses will be embedded in the correct sequence and will be requirements for the pathway. So that way, if you're in the business pathway, you will also get the CTE endorsement. Like, to have them sit separately is silly. So, just a couple of little like side things.
Yeah, that's right.
Just a quick question on like the logistics of it. So it sounds amazing, like, and I don't know how the law enforcement Kingsburg partnership works now. Those kids are still at South as South students, but they go like a certain number of times a week. Is it like voc where they?
Yeah, so sometimes they do it like on a half-day release. They try to line up schedules. Sometimes we do send and they become full-time students there. It just depends. Often it depends on how schedules line up and how they're scheduled and we're scheduled. Certainly, we try to maintain our kids being rostered to us as much as possible. But like even like kids that go out for half-day vote, they're still our kids.
Yeah.
They just go to vote for half-day.
No, and that system seems to have been figured out to a way that works,
Yeah.
where they have multiple homes, but they have a home
Yeah.
type of thing.
Yeah, so like it really depends on the scheduling, et cetera. And the requirements of the pathway too, right? Like you may have to be there full time because we don't offer all those courses,
Yeah.
right? And if they're, like the CTE sequence is 4 courses, it's a 4-course sequence.
Okay.
So, that's more realistic where we could send and you could still have this be your home school depending on if you could schedule out those things in the afternoons or in the AM, so that way you were here for the morning and not here for the afternoon. The busing also becomes a logistical thing because transportation is, difficult for just regular buses every day, let alone additional things, so, there's a lot of like moving parts. But, in theory, so like our next CTE will be something along the lines of, I would love for us to be able to put in something related to culinary arts. I just think that there's a big draw for that. I think it'll be a very popular pathway. I also know that we have like some operational kitchen space here because of our, our other stuff that's happening, and is there opportunity for some of those courses to be morphed into a culinary arts CTE pathway?
Does Brookdale have these programs, and we can just like buddy up?
There is some talk of, they're in a bit of a state of flux right now, like with dual enrollment and partnerships with schools, and it has been a very large conversation at the county. What they were doing previously was not working, so
Okay.
they're looking to reevaluate like how they partner with school districts.
Do they have like auto shop? Do they have facilities? I don't even know.
Yes.
Things like that they do. Okay.
Yeah. The latest conversation I was a part of was about a pathway dedicated to grooming future educators.
Yeah.
Because our candidate pools are so small, like education has become like challenging in people wanting to enter into that field. And where it used to be like, everybody wanted to be in that field. So we're looking for ways to try to grow our own workforce by offering potentially a CTE pathway that also translates into college credits. So like that kind of stuff is all being talked about. But unfortunately, nothing in education moves particularly fast. It's a wonder I've stayed this long, because I'm probably the most impatient person in the world. That's my husband and my children.
You're right. So that's where we are with priorities. I feel like we kind of did a lot of Q&A through. Is there anything that we left without? Next, I mean, we're supposed to meet in June again, and all my fingers are crossed that maybe we'll have real money to talk about in the meantime. But if not, we at least have a good idea of how things should be spent, and then we'll have a better idea of what to do with it then. And that's kind of the idea from there.
So now I'm gonna bore you with some other stuff. So, I did this presentation, so I'm not gonna do this thing in total, well, I guess I'll do it. At the board meeting last month. And the reason why I want to do this presentation here with PAC is because our ESSA accountability and those parameters for accountability is really what drives our federal funding in the sense of being eligible to receive, right? So the state of New Jersey receives a pot of federal money every year, and that is based under the Every Student Succeeds Act legislation, right? So if we don't follow the parameters outlined in the accountability requirements, we are, as a state, not eligible to receive federal monies. So if you think back to, and I hate for this is a very, very bad word, COVID, where we did not have the NJSLA because we're in school, right? Kids were being instructed, and there was this whole swirl about like, are we gonna test, are we not gonna test? And you may have heard, and I'm sure you did, that the New Jersey had to apply for a waiver. The waiver that was being applied for was to get excused from the accountability pieces of the ESSA formula because it dictates whether or not you're eligible to receive federal funding. So the federal government had to grant the waiver to the state of New Jersey in order to excuse us from giving the test because it's part of what the accountability formula is, which I'll show you in a minute. There's two pieces of it that is really dictated by state testing. So I think it's important to have perspective on how this all kind of comes down. This has implications for certainly school accountability and growth in progress, but it is tied directly to federal money. So back about 7 or 8 years ago, when the Every Student Succeeds Act was reauthorized, the state of New Jersey had to submit an ESSA plan which said, this is how we're going to meet your accountability requirements. And there are 3 factors that go into that. It's achievement, it's growth, some kind of growth number, statistic, and and a school quality indicator. And I'm gonna go over these pieces and what they mean for the state of New Jersey. So the state had to say, this is what we're gonna use for each of these pieces. These are the thresholds we're going to use. This is how we're gonna determine if people meet those requirements or not. Because back at that time, there was this emphasis on increased school level accountability. And how are we going to track that and monitor that to ensure that kids are progressing, right? And we're maintaining the qualities and integrity of our schools. So, I just talked about that. So part of this too, and it is tied to federal money, is that there are different categories of support based on your overall accountability number. So if you are considered to be a struggling school, a failing school, the state, with federal money, will come and support your school in different fashions. I don't know how many of you are aware, if you're Bayshore parents or you're in the Bayshore feeder elementaries, Bayshore had one of these statuses that was placed on them 5 years ago now. And I'll explain why it's 5 years in a minute, but because one of their subgroups underperformed on the math assessment, right? So they were considered to be one of these categories, which is called a targeted school, meaning a specific population did not perform at the threshold that the state deemed acceptable based on their demographics. So what ended up happening was they get put into a school status where they received federal money in a special title fund called SIA. It's a school improvement allocation, SIA. That started 5 years ago, and the first year it was about $60,000. Then the state realized, oh crap, we have so many schools that we're gonna have to give this to. Our money quickly dwindled, because it's a 3-year cycle for money. So you can't exit out of status for 3 years. If you're a targeted or comprehensive school, that's the other category. Bayshore would have probably exited after 3 years, however, COVID happened and we didn't have 2 years worth of testing, so we're on our 5th year. It's the gift that keeps on giving. It is just enough money to be annoying to spend. It's not enough money to do anything spectacular with. I think this year we got like $19,000. It's like we threw it to fund a piece of the interventionist salary and, you know, just called it a day, because it's hard to buy $19,000 worth of supplies. And it is also not enough to like really do damage to any kind of salary. And it's also money that's turned. So you don't want to give it to anything that you know you have to sustain for the future. So we just used it as offset money for the last year, but they did exit, so they won't get that money next year. However, I'm saying that because, you know, we have no schools this year that have been put into any kind of status. As I said, there's comprehensive and targeted. So comprehensive is like basically many of your subgroups are underperforming in many areas and on many components. I'll get into those components in a minute. And targeted is like you have a specific group, like Bayshore did, that we're gonna have to provide you specific support on. Part of this, and part of what Bayshore had to do, is they had to submit an action plan that was monitored internally and by the state for the years that they were receiving money, where they input data, they create building goals. It's actually a pretty good process, and we do use it for the learning design teams across the district. But you know, it is a requirement if you receive federal money under a targeted or comprehensive status. And you only have to do that until you're exited. So I just thought, you know, if ever a time, and hopefully there won't be, that you hear that your school is in a targeted or comprehensive status, that is what that means. One of those requirements of the ESSA accountability was not achieved. Same thing, I just kind of explained all that. So how is accountability calculated? So as I said, when the state of New Jersey submitted their ESSA application, they got to determine what they wanted to use for those 3 major buckets: achievement, growth, school quality. State of New Jersey chose NJSLA and the DLM, which is for our special ed population, as the achievement test. So students taking those assessments, that was going to be the achievement marker, point-in-time data to demonstrate that students were meeting standards, right? Like where they fell in relation to meeting standards. ELA and math growth. I have a whole perspective on this year, which, you know, I would digress if I shared, but in years past, it is something we use called a student growth percentile, SGP, which meant a student's growth, relative growth, was compared year to year, and it was based on like performers. So they gathered up based on all the kids that took the test in the state and fell into like the meeting category. And they compared them year to year to see how much those like performers grew relative to one another. Which is fine, you know, like there's always a skewed perspective on any statistic. It's really just how you frame it and how you're using it. Like I could make a number mean anything I want it to mean if I explain it correctly, which is kind of where the downfall of this year is, in that we didn't have 2 consecutive years of NJSLA testing, so the state invented another statistic to use in place of this, something that they refer to as a relative school improvement measure. And that, I'm going to explain this as simply as possible. They took the last 2 years that we had NJSLA, which was 17, 18, 18, 19. They found the average score between those 2 years, and then they took last year's score and found the average, and they subtracted the 2. And they found a difference of some sort. So say last year you averaged at a 750, and for those other 2 years of testing you averaged at a 700, you had a net gain of 50, a plus 50. They then took all of the scores of the schools that fall within your configuration, which I'll get into in a minute, and they said, we're going to give you a percentile ranking. Now, where's the flaw in that? I could have a year, like last year, where kids were probably not a lot of growth happened. Like, we didn't have 50s, 100s. Like, I technically could have had 0 growth, but been the highest, and I would have been assigned the 100th percentile, because nobody grew bigger than 0, right? Like, if everybody has a negative number for growth, if everybody declined, somebody's still getting 100, right? So, like, you can see where I'm saying it's kind of flawed. But I give them credit for trying. So when you see,
Give them 100. They're trying.
I'm like, why are these numbers so high? You know, and so the disconnect for me is like, why are the numbers in growth so high when our scores are either static or falling? And I'm not just talking about Middletown, I'm
Right,
talking
no.
about like
It's
the
everywhere.
state. Like,
Yeah.
I've seen
It is
historically
probably-
underperforming
it's not
subgroups and buildings, because I combed these, they came out in the first, when we were on spring break. And like, schools that were failing, like growing at the 90th percentile for ELA. That's a head scratcher to me, right? Like, all of a sudden, like, you've cured the reading deficits in your building in a year where there's been kind of disrupted instruction. So it is a skewed statistic, so I share it with you because when you see how this kind of all comes out in the end, you're gonna understand why, you know, take this information with a grain of salt. Don't put too much stock in the end number, right? So that ELA and math growth with this new measure, relative school improvement, this is a 1-year thing only. We'll go back to SGPs next year. That is only for 3rd through 8th grade, right? High school, they don't have back-to-back testing years necessarily. Now with the NJGPA, they definitely won't. So they use the graduation rate. That's their growth metric. They use the 4- and 5-year graduation rate in order to determine their growth indicator. Everybody in the state of New Jersey for school quality uses chronic absenteeism as their school quality measure. That is what the state chose in the ESSA application. There is another piece that does not apply to us. Even though we have English language learners, they take a specific test called the Access for Ls. If you have a population in a building of 20 or more, you would be considered to have that as a portion of your total package here, your total 100%. However, none of our buildings have over 20. We magnet our schools, right, like for elementary and for middle and high, so we consolidate them for services, but they still belong to their home school for statistics reasons, right? We don't bundle them when they get there.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
The absenteeism. So that's what New Jersey decided would be our state's indicator for the, school quality indicator.
Yes.
What do other states all use absenteeism as well? I'm just
I don't
curious.
know, you could have selected anything you wanted to as long as
Okay.
you justified what your school, I would assume most people would use some kind of absentee rate because of the fact that it's pretty like bare minimum in the sense of like
Just the
measuring,
engagement.
right,
Yeah,
like
okay.
it's not dependent on other things, like for instance, if I say chose to use like discipline referral rates.
Yeah, okay.
You know, I might have a group of staff members that aren't great at managing classroom behavior, so like that's gonna be a driven up number, whereas like chronic absenteeism is more standard in the sense of like, you come to school, you show up, you get credit, right? Like, it's not predicated on so many other things. So, I don't know of anyone else that's using something differently. It is, it's been okay for us. Like, our absenteeism in pockets is more concerning than others, but, we've taken lots and lots of steps over time to address those things. I will say for last year, because remember, this statistic comes out this year, it just came out, but it's based on last year's information, another lagging statistic. However, take the chronic absenteeism numbers with a grain of salt, because we were still kind of in that COVID area where like, if somebody sneezed, they went home, they didn't come. So I think our numbers across the board are slightly inflated than where they probably would normally be. It also depended on like how high of a threshold of, your building was in the sense of like, was your nurse sending lots of kids home? Was she more like, not as cautious? Like, it just depended. Because last year was kind of that blurry line where like, everybody was back, we wore masks for some of the year, but like some kids wore them, some didn't. Some sent home, some parents kept kids home because they were being cautious. I can appreciate that. So again, another statistic to take like with a little bit of caution when you see how it factors into the bigger picture.
It just seems odd to me that they use that when it's clear, it's like, when the metric is school quality and the measurement is entirely a family decision. not a school decision. So
Yeah,
it's like,
Actually, it was a school district, because we were still quarantining kids for 10 days and then 5
Yeah.
days, and that's all considered
Yeah.
absent. It's not
Yeah.
excused, but if you're sick,
Yeah.
so.
Well,
I mean,
and
we were causing kids to be chronically absent.
so another thing, so I'm gonna show you this, and so even though this is a statistic and it is dependent on parent decision of sending or not sending, et cetera, it is relative. So when we look at these statistics year to year, it's relative to what everybody else is doing too. So it's kind of like that philosophy of everybody's in the same boat,
Yeah.
right? So because these statistics aren't year to year, our summative scores are derived by comparison to relative performance of other schools in our configuration, which I'll get to. So how is accountability calculated? So it's based on 100%. Each of those areas, academic achievement, growth, and school quality, get a percentage of that 100%. And you are only compared within your configuration. So there are various configurations. There are pre-K to 5 configurations. There's K to 5 configurations. There's K to 8 configurations. We do not have that. There are 6 to 8. We do have our 3 middle schools. There are 9 through 12 configurations. So when you are compared for these assignment of scores and rank orderings, et cetera, you are only compared within your configuration. So like our middle schools are not compared to our elementary schools, our high schools are not compared to our middle schools. However, we are compared to other middle schools that have 6th through 8th grade students within them. Does not take into consideration demographics. There used to be an old system referred to as a district factor group, where you were compared to schools that had similar demographics as you did. However, that was phased out, and this new method of configurations was phased in. So we actually have elementary schools that aren't even in the same configuration, because we have 4 that have pre-K. So they're pre-K to 5 configurations. So that's important to know, because again, that idea of relativity, right? So again, taking these numbers at the end of the day, all these because you get a summative score generated, and just putting them in a lineup and saying you did better than this school did, you have to know the interworkings of the numbers behind the scenes and how things are compared in order to really be able to interpret this correctly. So here's the weighting for the various configurations. So pre-K to 5, K to 5, and 6 through 8 all have the same weightings within their configuration. Each of the achievement scores, the NJSLA, is 17.5%. The growth indicator score from each area is 25%. Now, this is definitely what I believe has inflated our inflated numbers across the state this year, because that growth indicator, remember, this was the invented statistic, right, where you could have grown 10 and been the highest winner and you get 100, right? That's worth 50% between math and ELA. It's great, but I also hesitate to get overly excited about it, because I know that it's kind of a skewed statistic embedded within, the larger formula. Chronic absenteeism, 15% for everybody. And then this is just our K to 8 configurations, the 6 through 8s, and then the K to 5s and the pre-K to 5s. One slight change for the 9 through 12, the weightings remain the same, but the growth is the 4-year and the 5-year graduation rate. So those each get 25% worth of the 100 for the summative score. So here's an example of a K to 5 configuration. So what ends up happening is each, based on achievement scores, and I'll just use this first, the ELA proficiency achievement score. This is not the proficiency score. Like if you look at this purely, because you can access this on the state's website at this point, it was released. This is the score that gets assigned to the percentage that you've achieved. So you could have gotten 62.96 points, but been at a 40% achievement rate, because it's relative, right? So 60 points is not bad, but that is dependent on everybody else's score, right? Like the highest person is going to get 100 points.
So they just curve it, the state just curves it?
It's curved, right, it's on a bell curve. So this is not a poor amount of points. However, it's only worth 17.5% of the total score. So the weighted points that are received for in this example, for the ELA proficiency score is about 11 points. Math, you can see the same thing. This is the score assigned based on the percentage of achievement, which is different. Here's our growth indicator scores, right? 95.38. Well, this example, you would assume they had a lot of growth. That's not necessarily the case because of how it was configured, right? Like it could have been 15 points for all we know. If that was the highest or one of the highest, then, you know, that would be something to look at. Math again, 96.55, another high score, right? And then chronic absenteeism, 15%, 33.20, which shows me that this example, they probably had a high absentee rate because they only got 30-something points for it. Now, all those weighted points are taken and added together. So this example, there was 72.49 points garnered from the formula. They then take those point values and they rank order them within the configuration and they assign you a percentile ranking. So your percentile ranking is not going to necessarily be somewhere close to that number because it's relative to how everybody else performed. If you were the most, you could have been at the 100th percentile. But this could have been, it could have been true to be at about, it depends, right? So it's all relative. So some important items to note. Somebody inevitably every year, and actually I saw an article come out over break, but it was more, it did not focus on this, it focused on, I want to say SATs, it was something, and I was like, wow, they talked about the performance reports, but maybe it was graduation rate. It was something like that I wasn't anticipating them focusing on, because inevitably news outlets will go to the DOE's website, they will pluck the summative percentile ranking off of everybody's score sheet, and they will say, look, so-and-so's at the 82nd percent, and somebody else is at the 40th, and this school's bad and this school's great. And in reality, there's a lot of other pieces that go into that, including configuration, including some of the inflated numbers, particularly this year that we're gonna see. So, you know, we sent that letter home over break purposely because we wanted people to be aware that it existed, right? That they were coming out, but also to, you know, use this as a level setting year, kind of take caution with the statistics. There are definitely some places to celebrate, but I think everyone needs to understand what goes on behind the scenes on getting to this number versus just seeing it in the newspaper and being like, well, that stinks, or wow, we're awesome, because that's not the full picture. But I brought it to this group, you know, it's good information, I think, for you guys to know, but also because it is 100% directly tied to our ability as a state and as a district to receive federal monies. Because without it, if we're in breach of this, we don't get a dime. Which is why, again, going back to, we had to apply for those waivers as a state for NJSLA, because we would have been missing that achievement and growth factor. Like, you know, more than half of our, like 80%, right? 80% of our accountability formula, John, you're the math guy. 85% of our accountability formula was not able to be acquired because we didn't take a test. Because only 15% was based on chronic absenteeism, and like everybody was absent, a lot.
So how many, like, we couldn't be the only state that didn't take a test. Is that like?
No, like everybody has to apply.
That
for
was
those
all
waivers. Yep.
across the
Yep.
board.
And you had to come up with a plan for how you were going to, so our solve was, we're gonna do Start Strong, right? Like, we're not gonna do that test, we're gonna do this test, which they ended up not using as a determining factor of any of this. Like, if you look at last year's performance reports, because they're archived, like, they're scant at best. You know, this year they tried to do something with it at least, but again, going back to that, like, kind of take a little bit of this with a grain of salt because of the fact that, especially those growth numbers, you know, there's a lot to understand behind that, to really know that, it's not necessarily you're doing that poorly or that well, it's if you don't understand how they arrived at that number.
How does either the percentile or like your total point score by your district get translated to the actual money? Is it as simple as almost like taxes, like there's a pool?
No,
you need
they don't,
that's this
it does
many
not,
units? Okay.
it has nothing to do with that. It's
Okay.
just if you're eligible to receive.
So that's it, it's not a
Yeah,
quantifying.
so the only way it dictates monetarily It doesn't have anything to do with any of our Title I through 5 funds, Perkins, Title I, et cetera. None of that matters. It's just whether or not you receive,
Okay,
based on your population numbers, et cetera, census, and, you know, your demographics. Where it does matter is in that special pile of money that I talked about for schools that have identified statuses,
Okay.
targeted or comprehensive. Because that money is predicated on whether or not you're targeted, how big your population is, or whether you're comprehensive, which means like you got a lot of work to do,
okay,
right? So like, as I said, when we first got SIA money for Bay Shore, it was roughly 63,000. It then dropped in successive years because a couple things happened. I think the state backed, they were very aggressive out of the gate, number one. And number two, they also realized that more year to year, different people were coming in and out of status. So while, you know, the federal pile of money that the state probably receives for this doesn't change drastically, how the state hands it out may. So that's where this comes into play in the sense of direct impact to money, in amount.
okay.
But the impact for us is like, if we don't, we aren't accountable as a district. Like, say we said, we're not giving the test, we're just not, we wouldn't be able to receive
Everybody
federal
else
money.
will receive.
Right, there'd be a lot of implications.
Okay.
So the other thing the state did, kind of as an aside, back when they re-upped this ESSA application and created this accountability formula, is and another piece of data that's interesting, in my opinion, unfair, but it is what it is they took the achievement scores, right? So like, they said, performance on the NJSLA in 2015-16, we're gonna use that, whatever you did that year, on your school-wide population, to set targets for the next 20 years.
20.
Yeah, so what they did was they took that performance, 15-16, and they said, what is the difference between that performance and 80%, which they were considered to be where they wanted everyone to be by 20 years from now, right? We're gonna chip away at it, that was the philosophy. So that baseline year, and I will use River Plaza as an example because Dave Whitman hates me to this day for it, he blames me personally, because I was the principal at the time, is in that year, River Plaza, in one of their grade levels, or in their school-wide, had over 80%. He has no difference
Yeah.
between his performance then and 80%. So forevermore, for the next 20 years, he has to be at 80%, or he doesn't meet his target,
Yeah.
which is like, not super fair considering those kids in 15-16, I think they graduated from high school or close to it at this time. So, or most of them have, so it's kind of, it's a little unfair because it's not the same cohort of kids, it's not apples to apples. You know, the argument is like, yeah, there are kids that are of that age that are required to meet the same standards, so they are comparable. I don't know. You know, I've seen tons of years where you get a group of high performers, you get a group of lower performers, it really kind of trends very erratically. You know, you stay within a certain lane, but, you know, it bounces year to year, it's just dependent. So every year, we already have in every building, for every subgroup that exists in our district and in each building, a target that we have to reach. So, and if we don't meet those targets, we could enter in to one of those statuses.
What if in the subgroup you only have like one kid? You're
You,
basically.
you don't count subgroups that are less than 20.
Okay,
20 or,
okay.
so 20 is the magic number. So like if you have 2 kids, it doesn't count statistically, right? Like it doesn't show up on a report. They use something called the suppression rule. Because with the philosophy, like you could figure out potentially who those kids are.
And the number is
also,
20 regardless of the population of the school? Like if you have.
correct, 20. Perfect.
And what happens, it actually happened in Bay Shore, they had 20 and in one of their subgroups and they didn't meet the target. And as the years progressed, they were still targeted, but they didn't have 20 in the subgroup.
Right, they didn't have 20.
So they didn't have a subgroup to
Yeah.
even measure.
Yeah.
So they had 3 years of, you know, maybe not having that subgroup, and then 2 years where they didn't take a test, so it was like I said, that kept on giving, and it was a hassle. Because it was like, yeah, to find a way to spend the money, do the plan, the kids that were in this subgroup were long gone, right? They had graduated, they didn't care anymore. But, so that, when we look at like how you could become a targeted school, it's based on those preset markers, your growth statistic, whether or not like you showed you showed typical, they refer to it as typical growth, and there's a range for that. Usually it's between like 30 and 80. This year they expanded it, it's like basically like breathing and above. I mean, it's pretty egregious, but, and then also, you could be targeted because you didn't meet your graduation rate or your chronic absenteeism rate. Now, if you've only not met it in one subpopulation, that's not necessary, because we have lots of places where they're not meeting specific individual, targets. That won't trip you into a status. It's a little complicated, but Bayshore was tripped into a status because that subgroup actually performed in the bottom 5% of all Title I schools. So that caused them to trip into status just for that one population. Whereas if they had performed outside above that 5%, it wouldn't matter. So it's complicated, right? Like when you look at that number and you get that number in the paper or you see it on the school report card, performance report, you just look at it for the number. But there are tons and tons of moving pieces that go into this behind the scenes that not many people in education even have a handle on this. I mean, we speak with people all the time, and it's complicated to understand the parts behind it. But, so, I mean, that's kind of it in a nutshell. I wanted to just bring it here because I felt like it was important in the sense of it's directly tied to federal money. In the sense of like, we get it because we are bound by this, which was pre-crafted through the state's ESSA application to the federal government.
And the money that the feds send to the state determines the allocation, or does the Fed, okay.
Yep. And the titles 2 through 5 are based on demographics, like school, like basic, the Title I is census every 10 years.
Which one was dependent on the school lunch?
Title I.
So it census.
And that's dependent, that dictates where our district's poverty line is considered. That's how the free and reduced lunch factors into that. Yes,
When are these results out?
they're out now.
Oh,
So if you Google NJDOE performance reports, it will bring you to the archive of every school in the state of New Jersey. You can search by district, you can search by school. There are lots of pages to that performance report. It gives you like broad statistics of the school. It talks about our, our violence and vandalism statistics, our HIB statistics, our teacher-student ratio statistics, like all kinds of demographic stuff related to your school. And then the last, either the last or the second to last tab is the accountability tab, which where it will bring you through exactly these statistics for your building. There is an achievement tab, which will just show you the achievement pieces, like vetted out by subgroup, like in grade 3 for your school-wide population, what was the performance level? And did they meet or not meet the target? Like that's on there. Like
And their
whether-
target is specific to their school from
that
2016,
preset
17
level,
or whatever.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Now, they do give a little bit of leeway in meeting those targets. There's something they refer to as a confidence interval. So you can meet the target with the confidence interval, like a little asterisk, that says you were close, but, so we're gonna give you credit, but know that that means you have your target plus a little more to make up for next year. So there is wiggle room, and the lower your score is, the larger your wiggle room is.
How does this work with New Mommy, since in
Yeah, when they
2015, 16, they were by themselves?
It's New Monmouth's scores from that year.
Okay,
Yeah.
so Port Monmouth wasn't like factored in or averaged in as part of the new target?
Nope.
Okay.
Those like statistics from 15, 16, technically in this, are just not existent.
Okay, they just fell.
Because all those, you can actually go on the state's website and you can look at all the preset statistics for every school in the state of New Jersey, for every subgroup that exists. If you have any extra time and you want. The spreadsheet is enough to like make your eyes go, because it's like literally just a spreadsheet. So finding your school and your county and then what demographic you're looking at, like, becomes challenging because there are multiple subgroups. Like, there are vetted targets for school-wide. economically disadvantaged, students with disabilities, ESL, if you have a 20, and they vet it out in a long list of spreadsheet for the next 20 years. Crazy. So,
Do you think that they'll change that formula since we'll have 2 consecutive?
they're gonna go back to the SGP. Yes,
Okay.
they will go back to a true SGP. The SGP, Student Growth Percentile, is also part of our teacher accountability system. So teachers also are given a piece of their summative score if they are in tested areas with a tested grade behind them. Like, there's no growth statistic for 3rd grade teachers because they don't give a test in 2nd grade. Right? So it starts in 4th grade. So if you're a 4th grade language arts teacher, you get an SGP as part of your summative score. So that's all gonna come back after we give a test this year. Because now we'll have last year's and this year's for comparison. This was a 1-year Band-Aid to meet the requirements of ESSA accountability. Because they needed a growth statistic, and the way that the SGP is calculated is based on back-to-back years of like performers. And because we didn't have a test for 2 years, like those kids, for instance, like if you were in 6th grade and we didn't have a test for a couple of years, you're like leaving, right? Like you're out of there. Like you're no longer in the configuration of comparison. So. So yeah, so if you're interested, I find it, this is what I like to do. This to me is a better comparison than any of this other stuff, is go in, look at the performance reports, find your school, and then think of schools in the area that are like you, right? Like not Middletown schools. There might be some Middletown schools that are like you, right? Like I could say, like River Plaza and maybe a Fairview. Even though they're different configurations, they're not that different demographically overall. Look at those 2 scores side by side, right? Like those summative scores. But look for other schools around us that have similar demographics, like other pre-K to 5s or other K to 5s in Monmouth County. I like that comparison better. Because it's relative to like, what are the others around us doing? Outside of our sphere of Middletown. So, that's always, and that's how the old distro factor groups used to work. It was a comparison within demographically similar schools. But, a lot has changed since then. So I hope I didn't bore you. Yeah, interesting.
It's interesting, just all of these pieces that go into all of this behind the scenes, and thinking about when you hear just like a parent like complaining about something. Like, I don't know, that's just what I go to because we are listening to all this information, and there's just so much you need to know to be able to make an opinion that's actually valid.
Right, which is why we did this year we did a lot of education on this at the board meeting, we're doing it here, because we felt like, if you just look at a number, like you're gonna have an opinion, and it might be a good one, it might be a bad one, but is that opinion really valid? Because of the fact that, if you don't understand at least some basic things, and it burns me every year, and it's something that drives me nuts, is like the media doesn't have a clue.
No.
And they just pluck the numbers, and the first year this came out, it was like hysteria, because the state accidentally put a rank order on their website. I was like,
Accidentally.
and then accidentally, I mean, they quickly pulled it down, but not before news outlets got it and started to make comparison. Like, actually, one of our principals has a headline that he still uses as a motivator. It was basically, someone's performing terribly and somebody's performing great in Middletown. And it's just that is such a skewed perspective.
So not fair,
And there are a lot of intricacies, but there are also a lot of nuances, like the fact that, and when we talk about achievement scores and targets, I always, when we talk to principals, we're like, look, it's important, it's a target, that's something to strive for, but also remember it's different kids year to year.
For sure.
Dave Whitman, I talk him down off the ledge every year because of that 80%, it was just a group of high-performing kids. And listen, they perform in the 70s, high 70s, low 80s year to year, because, kids typically function similarly within a demographic over time, more so than not. But, I mean, to hit 80 every year, like, that's a high
That's a
ask,
lot.
right? Like,
Right.
And the comparisons are always happening to a cohort above or multiple cohorts, like,
correct.
is there any metric that compares, like, the second graders in 2023 did this, so how did the third graders who were the second graders, how does the third grader score compared to when they were second graders?
We do that.
Okay.
We do that internally. So when we get our NJSLA scores, we have them imported or exported we import them into Linkit,
Yeah.
and we can run reports in that fashion, because as an educator, those are the more valuable reports for us. Like, are kids continuing to grow? Are kids not growing in a certain year, in a certain class, in a certain school? Like,
Well,
there's a
especially with
lot
COVID
of
stuff,
trends.
you know, you have 2 years.
Yeah.
it's gonna be tough.
Yeah.
And then your history of academia,
Yeah.
you know.
So unfortunately, this year, this statistic, in my opinion, even though it's always a little, I think, take it with a grain of salt kind of thing, this year particularly, this is for compliance. Like, I don't put much stock into it, and that's what the letter actually said. Use this as a baseline year, because things have been so disjointed, and the statistics behind this are different this year, so, look at it, use it for your information. Stay neutral with it, don't get overly excited or overly, upset about it, depending on where you fall on that continuum, because it really is, the statistics had a lot of external impacts that were uncontrollables, particularly in the last couple of years. So, lots of complicated stuff. So that's it. If you have any other questions, certainly, as you're looking at the reports, you can email one of us. We can certainly help you out. So, that's it. Deb, John, anybody else?
Thank you, that's very nice.
It's extremely impressive, and I think, to your point, nobody has any clue
No.
how much happens
Yeah.
behind the scenes and how your hands are so tied in certain respects and how creative you have to be, but you're all bound to kind of these standards that are out of your control, and like at the end of the day, then people are like, well, I think they should do it different. And so I can, it's just, it's head spinning, and we're the people who like pay attention and listen and try to follow it, and we're still overwhelmed. So I just thank you for
Just
how much you
keep that in
do.
mind on anything you hear out there when people disagree. They know only a very small
Yeah.
portion of the
Right.
story, and not,
Not the behind the
not
scenes,
behind
like
the
all
scenes
the
and other factors. and,
Yeah, it
you know.
is.
And it's frustrating because there's so many people who don't pay attention to this, so, like, for us, I don't know, it's just hard to convey.
No, people love being very entitled to their uneducated opinions.
Yeah, they don't
Yeah.
necessarily want to just take the
Yeah.
time to
Yeah.
understand it. They think they do, I think that's what it is. They think they understand it,
Right.
and they don't understand it.
Yeah,
and-
it's just such a big
Yeah.
bowl of
Just
Thing.
going back to
Bowl.
Title I, I just find this,
bowl of
how many Title I
mess.
schools do we have? I know it was not
Potpourri
part
of-
the school-wide targeted assistance, just a couple.
School-wide is one.
Oh,
One, Ocean Avenue only. At the middle school, it's Bayshore, Thorne. High school North. Then we have Leonardo, Fairview, New Monmouth, Harmony. Who am I missing? Ocean Ave, which I already said.
So about like
Bayview.
half as well. Okay.
So, and historically, they pretty much fall along those lines. Like I said, we have those couple of schools that bounce in and out, or on the border, they're not purely in one year, we fund them, and then they go back in purely the next year, so, there hasn't, I don't remember a time where we, like, eliminated a school.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.